Alright, so before I get started, I figured I'd give a quick little preamble, and that's that, the whole reason I'm making this video is because there's no info about the DTronics DT-01 in the manual. The manual tells you nothing when you buy it, and I've noticed that there's really no info about it or discussion about it on the internet. There's nothing on YouTube. There's nothing in forums about it. It's a pretty mysterious machine, so I figured I'd kind of dispel all the questions I have about it after spending time with it and share what I've learned. So the whole reason I bought this thing is because I felt like it would be a relatively cheap, quote unquote cheap, solution to trying to acquire, an antique PG-1000, which is the original type of programmer people used for the Roland D-50. Not only are most of them broken in some way, and it's hard to find one that's in good condition, but they're also extremely expensive and are basically like collector's items now. And they do make, Apple makes, or there's like some sort of Apple iPad app that allows you to edit the sysx data of the patches just like a PG-1000. But I'm not into that. I don't have an iPad. I hate Apple and I hate apps. I'm a grouchy old man and I like hardware. I don't want to be... It's just so lame and uncool to be up on a stage with a fucking iPad, trying to do a synthesis with, with a laptop. How lame is that? But there is one guy named Nick Habermel. I think he's a German guy, and he made a video about the DT-01, and he had some really great points and discoveries he made about it. So, I'm going to piggyback, no pun intended, on some of his points. But basically, I just wanted to kind of share with everyone an objective context of what all the little knobs on this thing do. So don't hate me when I'm just approaching it objectively, and that I'm not actually discussing maybe precisely what the knob is doing to the actual waveform or how it's directly altering the sysx data. Kind of like Nick Habermel said, when you're turning these knobs on the DT-01, it will not show you what parameters you're editing on the D-50's screen. You have to menu dive to see how those parameters have been affected. And I mean, that's no surprise. But basically, there's plenty of infos, and you can read the manual too, that discuss the architecture of a D-50. That discuss, the style of LA synthesis that it uses and how it combines subtractive synthesis with a complex array of samples. It's a highly programmable synth, but to me it's a preset machine, and there's just such a endless miasma of third-party created preset banks that you can download. So to me it's something that it's like not worth trying to program. Unless you're really good at programming and really quick at it, and really know exactly what you're looking for when you want to make your own patch, because there's so many great patches out there anyway. At the end of the day, I'm a guitar jock. I'm not a synth nerd, and to me this is something that I want to use in the context of live looping on a stage, to make spangle noises with, or Osric tentacle noises with. So, if you're a real synth nerd, you wouldn't have bought a D-50 or a D-05 in my case. You'd have a fucking Euro rack, and you'd be, slouched over it, feeling all elite about making your own complex synthesis arrangements. Yeah, so I guess before I get into it too, just as a disclaimer, I will be using a D-05, which is the boutique modern revamp re-release, whatever you want to call it, the original D-50. I do not have a D-50. Kind of like the PG-1000, they're expensive collector's items now, and most of them have, you know, fucked up parts or whatever, or broken mod wheels or things like that, or burnt out screens. And the architecture and programming with the hardware and the software and even the layout of the D-05, though, the modern D-05 is exactly the same as the original D-50 or the D-550 rack mount version too. All right, so before I really get into it, I'm just going to do a quick rundown. This is my rig. I made a custom wooden like box frame type of thing for my setup, and I painted on marble swirl paint and then these colorful orbs on it. And then, so let's go over the connections before I get into anything else. So what I've got here MIDI-wise, my MIDI connection is I have an Arturia key step, and the MIDI out is going into the DTronics MIDI in, and then the DTronics MIDI out is going into the D-05. The D-05's MIDI in, obviously. As far as audio goes, I just have the I have the output of the D-05 going. Ignore this headphone output. That's just an auxiliary audio signal I have, but for the purposes of this video and what I'm doing here, I have the output going. Ignore all this too. I've bypassed all of these little modules. I just have the audio going into the input of the Zoom MS-70 CDR digital effect pedal. And for the purpose of these videos, I'm going to have the effects on this thing bypassed unless otherwise noted, where I maybe want to show you something. But yep, that's the connections. Just to clarify too, the messages that are fed into the mini in of the DT-01 are mixed with the sound editing messages created inside of the DT-01. And the mixed message is sent out through the MIDI out. The MIDI through sends out the exact copy of the messages fed into the MIDI in. Quick thing I'll mention about MIDI is that the one issue with the DT-01 that other guy, Nick, mentions in his video, and they even talk about it in the manual really quickly as a disclaimer, is that although the DT-01, it is possible to play your D-50 over MIDI when the DT-01 is attached, it's not recommended because it can result in unreliable data or what they call sticky notes. And basically what that means is this thing will fucking crash kind of randomly if you're trying to do too many things with MIDI sequences, or you've just got too much going on. And if that ever happens, you know, you will have to reset. And a way to just kind of put yourself back where you're supposed to be is, if you crash, is to just press the init button, which means initialize, INIT, and it will transmit a blank patch to the D-50, which will make it easier to start a sound from scratch. And the init button, it's kind of dark over here, let me leave my lamp, is the button right here. And another thing, before I get it too far into this too, that I'll mention as another disclaimer, is on the D-05 side of things, or the D-50 side of things, anytime you have a patch selected, whenever you edit anything with any of these knobs, there's no way to really reset unless you reset the patch. So if I twist any of these knobs, I'm not able to go back to where I was, because you have to think. Let's say I start with this knob here, and I twist it all the way to the right. Well, if I'm still on the same patch, I can twist it back all the way back to where I had it. But if I leave it where it is, and then let's say I switch to another patch, well, it's going to start that next patch at the original setting. But now this knob is all the way over to the right. So, you know, the only way you can go is left at that point. And then at that point, you know, the relative turning that you're doing of each knob is going to be different when you switch to a different preset, because there's not some spring mechanism inside of every single one of these knobs that like puts them back to center. I probably didn't explain that very well, but I think you know what I mean. So if you ever accidentally, like, you know, smack into the pitch wheel and you're like, oh fuck, you know, my pitch is off, what do? I can't get it to go back to like the regular semitone that it's supposed to be. Just reset the patch. Just go over to a different patch and then go back, and it should reset. And then when you're powering this thing on too, I don't know if anything bad will happen if you don't do it this way. And I've done it the wrong way before, but nothing bad has happened yet. But you are supposed to power on the D-05 before you power on the DT-01. I don't know why that is, but they say in the manual that you have to do it that way. It could have to do with data scrambling. I don't know. Another thing you want to make sure before you get started, it should be kind of the default setting, but when you're setting your MIDI channel, you want to set the D50's basic channel to the same number as the MIDI channel on the DT-01. So the DT-01 defaults to channel number 1 when it powers up. You know, for channel 1 to 10, you would press buttons 1 to 10, and there are 10 buttons at the top. For channel 12, you would press button 10 and then button 2. So this would be button 2, because it goes from left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 all the way to 10. Step you want to do is you want to set the exclusive MIDI function of the D50 to on. So if you want to know how to do that, read the D50 manual, or I'm sure there's videos about it too. And like I said, you know, if you just want to start from scratch with a blank patch, press the init button, initialize, and look, we have a blank init patch on the... I'm just going to use the word D50. I'm not going to call it the D-05. I know earlier I discussed that, you know, to reset the way a patch is, you would just, if you accidentally do something you don't want on here, you can just change the patch and then go back to the one you were working on. Keep in mind though, that that patch you were working on, all that data is going to disappear, whatever you edited on the DT-01. It's going to go back to the factory default unless you decide to save the changes you make. So I'm not going to get into that either, because there's lots and lots of tutorials on how to write a patch on the D50. But you would just follow those same procedures if you make edits to a patch on the DT-01 and you want to save it. But for the context of what I'm doing, I'm not really using this to create patches in my living room. I'm wanting to do live sound editing on the fly in real time. But nonetheless, I am going to discuss every one of these knobs, you know, and their purpose and how they are used to edit a patch. All right, so from a practical point of view, just to understand like the practicality of what these are for, the mute arm buttons and then the partial selector buttons, is so let's say you're wanting to edit just a partial. What you would do is you would, let's say you just want to edit only partial lower 1. So the lower 1 partial, you get rid of these ones. And, you know, you guys have probably already noticed, but what sucks about these LED lights is they sort of light up the adjacent buttons too. But just keep in mind that only this one is selected right now. You kind of have to look at it head on to tell. But yeah, it's kind of shitty. But only one of those, believe it or not, is selected. So that might annoy you throughout the length of this video, but that's how it looks in real life. It's not a camera thing. But in any case, getting back to what I was saying, So right now we're only editing lower one, but we can still hear all of them. So we can twist knobs all day long and not really hear exactly what's going on to just that specific partial, because all the other info from the other partials are coming through. So what you would do is you would mute the other ones. So now we're only listening to the partial that we're working on. See how you can only hear that one now? And now, yeah. Another major thing to understand before you start fucking with anything on this device. It's kind of hiding in plain sight, but it's still so easy to overlook, and I didn't understand it until I looked at it for a while. But basically, if you look at this entire array of knobs, each of these knobs pretty much has two different functions that it does. And there is a row above the knob and a row below the knob. And each knob will have a white row above it and a either red or a blue row below it. And within both of these rows, there is text printed inside of the row that tells you what the function is. Well, then you're asking yourself, well, shit, how do I know if I'm doing the function that's in the white row or doing the function that's in the red row, or in the case of these ones down here, what's in the blue row? So here is what I figured out. And like I said, it's hiding in plain sight, but if you look up here where it says common select upper and lower, you see how that's written in blue? Well, that's because that corresponds to the blue rows. So what that means is that if you are in common mode and not the specific partial mode, and you're editing your commons of upper and lower, meaning all the partials in upper and all the partials in lower, then whatever is in the blue row is the function that you are affecting with the knob. Conversely, if I select the individual partial, any one I want, or all of them, then the function that is being edited is the function in the white row. So for example, I am on the preset 2-15 called Fat Warm Pad on the D-50. Right now, I am selecting the individual partials. So what I'm doing is, if you zoom in over here, if I can get the fucking thing to focus. Well, you can't really see it very well, but it says cutoff frequency. So I'm affecting the cutoff frequency of all the partials right now because they're all selected. So this is what that would sound like. So that's the text that's in the white row. Now, let's go back to the common mode where I am selecting my commons. What it says for that same knob in blue is structure. So I'm not quite sure what that does yet, but I can hear that it's doing something. And it's doing something different than a cutoff frequency, which is what the white row effect was. So that's a very important principle to understand before you can really do anything else. And the manual does not discuss that. I guess it's technically hiding in plain sight, or maybe I'm just a retard and I should have caught that, but I don't know. It seems kind of sneaky to me. All right, so I just got done talking about the blue rows. Let's talk about the red rows. So whenever you are not in individual partial select mode, but you are over here in your upper and lower common mode, you can see here in red text, really sneakily, they spell out patch. So what I'm assuming for now, what that means is that it edits the total everything of a patch. And to me that makes sense because it says patch first of all, so that should include everything in the patch, I would imagine. And if you look at the things that are in these red rows, they seem to be like total final type things. Like down at the bottom it says total volume, reverb type, reverb balance, output mode. These things that seem to be, you know, total global type things and not just partial specific things. Of course, I should mention too that if you deselect both of these so that there is no LED, you cannot make any changes with the knobs to a patch. They will not affect anything. You must select which commons you would like to edit. So I'm going to turn this back on to both upper and lower. All right, so the next thing that's important to know is that the most efficient way to select how many of the partials or tones, as they're also known, to edit is you use these buttons over here, the common select. So as anyone who's familiar with the D-50 knows that there is a upper and lower tone that you can edit. And right now it's hard to see because I have the lamp, but if I shut the lamp off, you can see that the buttons will light up when they're activated. So I'm going to select both the upper and lower tones. And that way anything that I'm editing on the DT-01 will affect both the upper and lower tones of the D-50. And just to reiterate too, I've deselected all the ones that I had armed so that they are muted. And I went over and turned on, these were out before, but I turned them on, the upper and lower commons, and I'm still not getting sound. So that just lets me know that even if you mute all these and then you come over here and you turn your commons on, the mute is still in effect. And now it's back to ARM mode. The manual doesn't discuss any of this shit. They're very unclear about it. So that's why if you're unhappy that I'm talking too much about this stuff, I mean, you know, just buckle in because, you know, I'm the only one talking about any of this. Another important rule that I thought I'd discuss about the way the mutes work is it's important to understand that if you have them all armed and you decide to, so this is what it'll sound like when I have them armed and nothing is muted. This are all four of the partials being heard on this preset. So let's mute all but one of them. So we're only hearing the partial called upper 2. This is what it sounds like again with all of them. And then that's just the little flimsy upper 2 partial by itself. Now, if we reset this or decide to change patches, either way, what's going to happen is this LED right here is going to stay lit. So it's going to look like that one partial is still active and the other 3 are muted. But it turns out that even though that LED will stay lit, even though we reset the patch over here, it will also reset the armings of the mutes, meaning that none of the mutes that you had activated will apply anymore, even though the LEDs are out. So that's really important to know because you might reset a patch after muting a couple of partials, and then you'll look back over here after changing your patch, and you'll go, oh, hey, I've still got one partial active and the rest are muted. So that means the rest are muted, right? Nope. They are back on. So I'll prove that to you. So here again. We can only hear one now because they're all muted. Watch what happens when I reset this. See, you can hear all the partials, all 4 of them, even though it looks like only one is active. So that's just important to know that the LED lights lie to you. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to mute partials. And right now I have the preset of the D-50 called Metal Harp selected. Another quick discovery that I made that's important is that when you have the upper and lower and or either selected as commons, you cannot select these individual upper or lower 1 and 2 partials. However, if you turn any of these off, you can now select them individually. But when these are selected, you can still turn on your commons, but it just doesn't work the other way around. When your commons are turned on, that you cannot select these down here. All right, so if you want to get more specific with upper and lower partials, rather than doing upper as a whole or lower as a whole, you can edit specifically lower 1, lower 2, upper 1, and upper 2. And you can deselect them as well. And if they are deselected, then you will, sorry, I should have had those highlighted first. You will be defaulting back to whatever you have picked over here on the very right with your common uppers or common lower. Right now, I have nothing selected. I just have the regular patch coming through. Now, this middle row of buttons here are the mute buttons. You can see it says it, partial mute. So if I select these so that their LED lights turn on, nothing is muted yet until I press them again. So right now, I only have these upper 3 armed but not muted. I have muted this lower 1. So the sound is a little bit different. There's one of those partials that you can't hear anymore, but let's keep going. You hear how the partials are disappearing? Now nothing is coming through. I'm playing the keys and there's no sound. Now if you turn these back on, they are armed to be muted again. But the DT-01 is in a different state now than before, meaning that whenever I had changed patches or started up a patch to begin with, and I hadn't selected any of these partial mute buttons, they were not lit. I had to arm them and they were unarmed. But now that I've gone through that and I've armed them, muted them, and then armed them back again, they can only exist in 2 states. Either they can exist in the state where they are lit up in red and they are armed to be muted, or they are muted and the LED lights are out. Before, when I had just started the machine up, it was kind of in purgatory where I hadn't pressed anything yet, so nothing was lit up, but nothing was muted either. It was just in its default mode. All right, so before I launch into the rabbit hole of discussing and analyzing what these little knobs do, just as a disclaimer, a lot of what these knobs do may seem very subtle or even inaudible because it's so dependent on what type of patch you're using, and then within each patch, because each patch is so different. I mean, it also depends on if you are editing all the partials at once or just one specific partial, and that's because some partials are a lot more subtle than others. You may have a preset that is made up of an upper common that is like a bunch of bell sounds, and then maybe the lower is like a trumpet, or maybe like a really subtle like string pad, and it's going to be a lot harder to hear maybe what like the chorus knob down here does to the strings on that than maybe if you select a completely different patch where that partial is not like a string pad, but like a glockenspiel or something like that, and then you can hear right away, oh yeah, that's a spicy chorus. So just bear that in mind as I'm going through this, that maybe I might have to select specific patches to show you stuff, or maybe you may find that you're not hearing a very good example of what some of these knobs could do had they be given a better patch assigned to demonstrate them. So yeah, in summary, because you need to have a pretty distinct, if you're like, it depends on what you're trying to do with this thing. If you're trying to use this thing to like customize your own patches and then store them on your D50 for later use, then you can really spend all day tweaking these knobs and making little subtle customizations and stuff like that. But if you want something that like you're doing drastic changes to the sound in real time, like let's say you're trying to do the classic like acid house side trance like squiggle bubble filter cutoff, little spiraling noise that you hear in like Spangle and stuff like that. I mean, you know, you're gonna want to make sure you're picking a patch that's like really like bright and plucky and not some like soft like string pad type of patch, but you're gonna want to be picking something that's like some like really sharp, like crisp, like sine wave or something like that. Because otherwise these knobs are pretty subtle. And that being said, I mean, you know, it's all about what you're trying to do. So like I'm trying to, like I said, even though kind of contradictory to what I've been saying I'm trying to do, I mean, the real way to like make drastic changes, if you're like that don't involve editing, where you're just affecting the actual sound coming out of the device and not the programming of the sound internally, is to get an effects pedal at the end of your chain. Because that way, I mean, no matter what sound is coming out, this effect pedal has a final say in what it's doing to that waveform. Whereas with the DT-01, I'm programming what is happening to that sound based on the parameters that, like the threshold that it is allowed, that Roland has allowed each preset. So what that means is Roland will have a set threshold of programmability to what I can do to each partial of one of these sounds. Whereas if I run it through any effect pedal I want, I mean, I can do whatever the effect pedal is capable of to that sound. So, you know, that sounds like it's pretty self-explanatory, but I feel like it's just good to talk about that, because a lot of people might be really wondering if they should buy this fucking thing, because it's not exactly cheap. So it really, you really kind of have to have your sights set on what you're trying to do, as a whether you're a synthesis person or you're, you know, someone who wants to jam on some presets. Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of set the scope. All right, to illustrate what I just discussed about how you can take two different approaches depending on what you're trying to do with the sound. I'm going to show you what it sounds like to try and do a cutoff frequency sweep slash resonance sweep type of thing. I'm going to be doing the same exact procedure. They might have different parameters, so they're going to sound different, like obviously, but I'm going to show you what it would sound like to try and make that sound on the DT-01 versus trying to do the exact same thing on this external synthesizer pedal that I have. So I'm going to, one is going to be, like I said, affecting the parameters of the actual patch internally, and then the other is going to be affecting the actual waveform of the outcoming audio, irregardless of the programming. So first I'm going to show you the DT-01. This is the arpeggio. It's going to be an arpeggio being generated by the D-05. And the preset that I have is, I have it on hold mode. So it's just running right now. Okay, so you just heard what I did with the DTronics DT-01 to do a resonance cutoff frequency filter sweep type thing, right? So I'm going to do the exact, well, I wouldn't say the exact same thing, but I'm going to be using the Zoom MS70 CDR that has the same naming of the knobs for that effect parameter, where there is a cutoff frequency knob that I'm going to be turning and also a resonance one, just like over here on the DT-01. And you'll listen how I'm acquiring a similar effect, but I mean, it's still a different thing. It's still a different sound. Maybe to your ears, you might like it better, you might like it worse. It all depends, you know, contextually what you're trying to do. So here we go. So without further ado, we are going to get into the dreaded knobs. All right, so hopefully you kind of heard how it sounds to take the internal programming approach versus the external synth approach. Obviously, you can't really compare them because they're different things going on. Not only is this item affecting the audio signal after it comes out of the machine rather than programming it within the parameters it's allowed, but I mean, it's a different effect built by a different manufacturer, blah, 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 blah. I'm not quite editing the same exact thing conceptually, but it was the closest effect that I could find that allowed me to tweak a knob that affected the cutoff frequency and also tweak a knob that affected the resonance, just like over here on the DT-01. And by the way, that was a filter preset I was using on the Zoom over here. All right, so I'm going to start with the common select type effects, aka the rows of effects that you see in the color red or color blue. So if it's color red, it's going to be affecting the entire patch. And just in case you know you're unaware, a patch is any preset on the D50, and it is comprised of an upper and lower tone. That is the nomenclature they use, a tone. And each upper or lower tone is comprised of two partials. So without further ado, we're going to work our way from the top to the bottom and from the left to the right. So we'll start with the patch, the red ones, and the blue, the common effects. We'll work our way all the way down to the bottom right over here, and then we'll restart with the white rows, meaning the individual partials. So let's start with this knob here called Afterbend. This one, it doesn't really seem to do much, but what the manual says, the D50 manual I should say, is that it basically affects the sensitivity of the aftertouch when it comes to pitch bending with the pitch bending wheel, and that sensitivity will depend on what you have adjusted for each patch in regards to this knob all the way over here on the far right, which is the bender range. So the far left knob and the far right knob basically work together. This one just has to do with aftertouch, which is basically just the way that MIDI is communicated when you hold down a key. That's what aftertouch means. and usually it affects parameters like volume or velocity, shit like that. But the more important knob for adjusting how your pitch range of a preset is going to be this one over here. So what this does is, if you have it turned all the way to the left, it means that if I'm trying to bend a pitch, and I have an initial patch loaded up, by the way, nothing happens. If I bend it all the way to the right, it's going to let me go up 2 octaves. All right, so now I'm going to discuss this knob here, porta mode. So that's the mode of portamento. So what this does is it selects the tone that should take on the portamento effect. When the key mode is whole, portamento always works whichever of the 3 modes may be selective. And those 3 modes are U, L, and UL. U only works on the upper tone, L works on the lower tone, and UL works on both tones. Even when portamento is set to on, the portamento on-off message sent from an external device can change the settings of portamento. So what does that all mean? So this is what this patch 2-14 sounds like with no portamento, just dry. Let's turn on portamento. And you can, I have portamento mode all the way to the left. So I assume that's U mode. It's kind of a dry patch, maybe. Maybe that's why we're not hearing much. I selected a patch that's a little more crisp, so you can hear the portamento. So I have it just affecting the upper tone in portamento mode all the way to the left. Now, we're going to talk about this knob now, which is porta time. So this porta time knob basically refers to, it sets the time of the portamento from one note to the other. Higher values make the time longer. And it goes from 0 to 100 value-wise for the knob. So right now I have it at 3/4, 75%. So let's see what that sounds like. That's your standard kind of portamento sound, that little detuned kind of effect. If I turn it off, turn it back on again, it kind of does that kind of detuning. So let's turn the portamento time all the way to the top. So I assume that's slower. Yeah, you hear that? It's a way slower detuning. Turn it all the way to the left. And it's so quick you can't hear any of the portamento really. All right, this next knob here, called hold mode, when basically it allows you to select 3 different choices of U, L, and UL, just like the port knob for portamento. And like before, it works on the upper tone for U, L is for lower tone, and UL is for both tones. What it has to do with is it selects which of the tones that the pedal hold effect is active for. If you have an external like sustain pedal or like a MIDI pedal, I assume too. So we're not going to demonstrate that here because I don't have a sustain pedal. This next knob here is called chase mode. And the chase play function makes it possible to output the lower tone slightly later than the upper tone, which is usually played on the keyboard. This function, however, is only available in dual or whole key mode. So as you know, the different presets, if you're familiar with the D-50, in the bottom left of the preset screen, it'll tell you whether or not you're in dual mode, split mode, or whole mode, or whatever. And I'm not going to get into that right now. There's plenty of info in the manual about that. It's like the first page. But dual mode is active for the patch that I'm in now. And like I said, it works for only dual and whole mode if you're using this chase knob. So the two modes of chase that work, like I said, are dual mode and whole mode. Only patches with dual mode or whole mode. Dual mode or whole mode will work. And the different values for this knob are UL, ULL, and ULU. So if you have a patch that's set to dual, UL will be the mode where it'll sound the upper tone and then the lower tone after it. If it's ULL, it'll be the upper, then the lower tone is repeated. If it's ULU, then the upper will play, and then after that the lower and the upper tone will alternate. Now if you have a patch that is in whole key mode, if the key mode is whole, then the UL mode of chase will do this. It'll play the upper tone twice, unlike dual mode. In dual mode, like I said, it would do the upper tone and then the lower tone, but in this mode it just plays the upper tone twice. And then you go to the next, which is ULL, and unlike the dual key mode, in whole mode the upper tone is just repeated and that's it. It's not like dual mode where it does the upper and then the lower tone is repeated. If we go to our next mode, which is ULU, it just repeats the upper tone just like the previous option. So whole mode is a lot more basic than dual mode in this case. So that probably just bored you to tears, but now I'm going to illustrate what the chase mode actually does. So I have a preset 1-14, which is called Arco Strings, and to give you an idea of what the upper and lower sound like so you can understand what's going on here, I'm going to show you. I'm going to mute the lower. Now I'm going to mute the upper. So you can see that the upper and lower sound different than each other, right? Okay, so now I'm going to set this next knob over here called chase level, which is pretty self-explanatory. All it does is adjust the level of sound that is heard after a delay relative to the upper tone, which is heard first. Higher values produce a higher level. So we're going to turn on chase. So you can hear there's that delay of the lower. It's the upper first, then the lower. That's because I am all the way to the left on the chase mode, which is UL for upper tone, then lower tone. And keep in mind that I am on a preset that uses dual mode, not whole mode. So let's move this chase mode knob a little bit. So now it's doing the upper tone, and then the lower tone is repeated infinite, which is ULL. And I turned the chase level knob all the way to the right, just so I could exaggerate this so you could hear the difference. You can hear it's fading out very slowly. If I were to turn the chase level down lower, it fades much quicker. So let's try the chase mode all the way to the third option, ULU, upper, lower, and then upper alternates. So that sounds kind of obnoxious right now, but that could be a really, really cool knob to use on the fly because you can hear how dramatic the effect is. So that's something to keep in mind if you have a preset that has a really interesting upper and lower and you put it in chase mode, you can basically almost have like a repeating sequence and really come up with cool stuff. I mean, imagine putting on some After Effects like delay, or maybe even running that through an arpeggiator or a sequencer. In fact, let's try an arpeggio real quick. So that sounds kind of lame, but I mean, just imagine if you had planned that out with like the perfect juicy preset that you picked and everything. Some dramatic, cool stuff you can do with that. Basically, what you're able to do with that is you're able to add a whole nother dimension to an arpeggiator or a sequencer. Because with an arpeggiator or a sequencer, you can organize a string of notes and they play automatically in principle. But you open up a whole like fourth dimension when you add the possibility of having the upper tone and lower tone alternate off of each other when you have chase activated, so, or you know that which is basically a delay. And that brings us over to this knob over here for chase, which is called chase time. Turn it all the way to the left. Very quick delays. Turn it all the way to the right. Turn it to the middle. Kind of moderate pace. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So I have an arpeggiator running right now, where all I've done is I've put the arpeggiator on hold mode, I played a chord, and I walked away. And now I can just turn the knobs. And you're changing the dynamic time-wise of what's going on as you twist these knobs. So this is giving you an idea of what you can do in a live setting. You just slap a chord and take your hands off the keyboard, and you can just play with this. All right, so let's move over to the right to this half of the device. Now we're looking at the L key shift knob. So what this does is it allows you to shift the pitch of the lower tone in semitone steps. So, and that's a value from -2 octaves to +2 octaves. And basically what the tuning of these tones is so the relative pitch of the upper and lower tone can be separately set in this way. So by setting slightly different pitches, a detune effect can be obtained. Also, by lowering the pitch of the upper tone and raising the pitch of the lower tone, the pitches of the two tones can become exactly the same. So I have a preset called harpsichord selected. So here is what it sounds like with just the upper tone. Just the lower tone. So what I've learned is that when you have this knob at center, that means that it is in unison. The upper and lower tone pitch is in unison. So that's 2 octaves down. So here's what's the fucking point of this? Where could this be useful? Well, maybe you have a song in your set list where you know that you have a certain key that the song is in, or certain chords that are being played. And you know that maybe if you set this knob to have the lower tone be like a fourth or a fifth or a third or a ninth or whatever down from the upper tone, then you can just strike one key and it'll match that chord that's in the background. Now we're 2 octaves up. So that's the use of that key. That's where you could apply that. And just imagine if you were to put it in a grander scheme, a grander context. You know how I just showed you the chase modes, how you can kind of do like synthetic, like man-made, like fake, like sequencing that way? Well, try slapping that on top of it, where not only is the lower tone delayed and alternating in a certain way based on your chase mode from the upper tone, but you're now adding a pitch effect to the lower tone that's different than the upper tone.
And as you might expect, the one to the right of this one is called L fine tune instead of L key shift. It's called L fine tune. So I'm going to guess that that does cents instead of semitones. Yep, that's what it does. And then center is normal. And then down all the way is 2 cents, up all the way is 2 cents. So it's the same exact thing over here with the U key shift and U fine tune, but it does the upper tone instead of the lower tone. Another useful thing that I can already see about these knobs is that some of the presets on this thing might sound kind of boring to you at first glance when you're trying to maybe get a strike of creativity and compose something, and you're just staring at, you know, a patch that's like a clarinet and it's not doing anything for your brain. Well, if you change the shift, if you shift the pitch of the upper versus the lower, well, that's a whole new sound. That doesn't sound like a fucking harpsichord. That sounds like some, some trippy shit. The U fine tune, the next knob over, is just the same exact thing with the upper tone, but it deals in cents instead of semitones. This knob right here is called tonal balance. And what it deals with is the volume balance of the upper and lower tone relative to each other. So yeah, it's self-explanatory. It just, we're in harpsichord right now. So that's kind of a cool effect. So in the context of a live situation, you could have put on an arpeggio. So now let's turn this knob. So that almost has the same effect as some sort of a filter sweep, but it's not the same thing. I'm just adjusting in a really smooth, fluid way, not a jagged way, the balance of how much of the upper tone you're hearing versus the lower tone. And I think that adds a whole another dimension to sequential synthesis. I really like that. So this whole top row and summary of red, you can use in conjunction with each other for some really dramatic types of dynamic kinds of effects. They're not really very subtle at all. They're very dramatic effects. So I think it's good that they're all in red. We already talked about bender range. That was the first thing we talked about. How after bend seemed to kind of not do much as far as the hearing what the sensitivity of aftertouch to the bender range does was pretty weak. But if you just focus on this knob, which allows you to adjust the range of how far you can bend the pitch of any given patch, that's gonna, be the more important knob. Okay, so now we are moving down to this next row, and we're going to start from the left. So we're looking at the blue row. So it says structure. So what structure refers to is the ways that the partials are combined. And what this knob does is whenever you turn it to any setting, you can't go back to the original way that the structure was, is what it seems. So don't touch this knob unless you really plan to alter the structure. So basically what's happening is there's 7 different positions along this knob, and each of them have a different way that they're combining the first or one partial and another. And so the patches that make up, or sorry, the partials that make up any patch are a different arrangement of synthesizer sound generators and PCM sound generators, meaning basically, you know, uh, synthesizer a synthesizer sound and a sample. Um, the sample is usually the first sound that you hear, like it'll be a sample of a harpsichord being plucked. And then the thing that's chasing after it or being sustained is usually a synthesizer sound that they programmed at Roland to kind of match best of what the sustain of a harpsichord pluck might sound like. That's how these things work. So getting back to this knob, you're combining, I'll just go through it. So this is the list from the manual for the 7 different structure combinations. So number 1 is the S stands for the synth generator, and the P stands for the PCM, and the R that you can see stands for a ring modulator. So if I have the knob turned all the way to the left, it's going to be mixing partial 1 and partial 2 of your preset in regards to the synth sound generator. You can see there's an S and another S. You go down to structure 2, and it's 2 synth generators yet again, but this time it's mixing partial 1 and ring modulation. So I'm not going to go through all this list verbally. It's going to take too much time, and I've already kind of dilly-dallied. But let's just give an example of what this sounds like. So right now we have the first patch on the D50 called Fantasia. And let's go ahead and mute the uppers so you can hear what well, let's hear what the patch sounds like with everything first. Upper and lower. So that's all you can hear now is that the lower tone, which is that bell tone. Now let's mute the bell and make it so we can only hear the upper. Kind of subtle, but you can hear it's like a droning kind of sound. So let's play with the structure knob now. So I have it in the first position, which is a mixture of partial 1 and 2. But what you're asking yourself, well, why does it sound all fucked up? Why doesn't it sound like the lower tone that I showed you before, which was that bell sound? Well, it's because it's not including the PCM aspect of it. It's the synth sound generator aspect of it. And it's combining the synth sound of partial 1 and partial 2. So that's why it's, it's misleading to, I guess, when they're using just the words partials here. I turn the knob more, and you can hear that ring modulation now. That little gyrating kind of effect. Position 3 is a mixture of partial 1 and partial 2, but in this case, unlike structure 1, in this case, in structure 3, we have the first partial being the PCM, and you can hear that little bell. That's that sample, the PCM. And then partial 2 is the synth. Now I'm in position 4, which is a mixture of the PCM, partial 1, and also ring modulation. Position 5 is mixture of partial 1 and ring modulation, but this time we have the synth for partial 1 and then the PCM for partial 2. And the PCM in partial 2 is more of a bell, like a clock tower bell. And then, the PCM for partial 1 is more of like a little like triangle type sound. Fantasia normally kind of masks the difference between the two of those little bells because they're laying on top of each other when you play it normally. We move over to position 6, and it's just a mixture of both PCMs like I just described. There's that little clicky triangle, tiny little bell, that chimey one, and then there's also the big clock tower bell. We go all the way over to position 7, and this 7th structure is both PCMs, but also ring modulation. It doesn't really sound like that though, but whatever. You get the idea of what this knob does. That's the point. So going over to this next knob, let's reset the patch. So the patch is reset. So this is really self-explanatory. This is just partial balance. So it's just, if I move it all the way to the left, you hear the partial 1 piece, the partial 1 sounds. If I move it all the way to the right, that's partial 2 sounds. All right, so moving over to this section, which is called pitch mod. It includes these 3 knobs here. So the first one is called LFO-D, and that's LFO depth. So that sets the depth of LFO1, which controls the WG pitch. Higher values deepen the effect. And just before I get any further too, in case I didn't already mention it, anywhere you see WG in regards to the Roland D-50, it stands for waveform generator. And so that has anything to do with any aspect of a partial that deals with OSC, or which stands for oscillation or oscillator, and that deals with primarily with the pitch and the functions that shape the wave of the synth generator aspect, and not the PCM aspect of a partial. So to illustrate what I mean by that, this is Fantasia again, the patch Fantasia. So if I turn this LFO-D knob, I'm going to hold down a note. So you can hear that synth sound that's being sustained is the synth sound generator aspect of the partial, not the PCM. The PCM is unaffected when I turn this knob, because the PCM is that little bell sound, that sample that you heard only when I press the key initially. So when this knob is all the way to the left, the LFO-D, it's at the 0 value, which means it's at 0 depth. If I go over to 100, it's as deep as it goes. All right, so I'm going to skip this lever knob for now, but I'm going to go over to this one that's called after. So this refers to aftertouch range, and it sets the sensitivity of the aftertouch that controls the volume of the LFO. So when you turn it all the way to the left, that value lowers the volume by a stronger aftertouch, and when you move it to the right, that positive value increases the volume by a stronger aftertouch. So what does that all mean? So let's listen to. I turned up the LFO so you can hear it for the synth generator partial for Fantasia. You can hear that droning synth. You can hear the LFO. All right, so let's mess with aftertouch sensitivity. So if I tweak this knob, so I'm going to hammer a key really hard. And that LFO sounds kind of weak, even though I hammered the key pretty hard. Now let's turn it all the way to the right. I'm going to hammer the key hard and listen to that LFO. You hear how it kind of rears its ugly head a little harder? Turn it all the way to the left again. Or I guess it's louder when it's to the left. I don't know. That's such a subtle feature. I don't really give a fuck about this knob, to be honest with you guys. I'm not really sure I even demonstrated it properly. Okay, so let's take a look at this next knob, which is called lever. So what this one does is it's the pitch lever modulation. So it sets the sensitivity of the vibrato depth controlled by the bender lever. So higher values deepen the effect, lower values soften the effect. All right, so let's test it out. So listen to that droning synth generator partial. Now, when I move the mod wheel, you can hear how it's modulating like that. I have the lever turned in the center position, right? So let's turn the lever all the way to the right, and now let's try the mod wheel. See how that's gnarly? Now let's move it all the way to the left. Now it's a really subtle modulation. Okay, so now let's move over to the third knob that's in the pitch mod series, and this is called after, which stands for aftertouch, and that's in regards to pitch aftertouch modulation. So it sets the sensitivity of the vibrato effect controlled by aftertouch. Higher values deepen the vibrato. I can't say that fucking word. So you're hearing it in center position. This is the aftertouch. Lower it all the way to the left. And move it all the way to the right, and you can hear that gnarly vibrato, right? So I'm a little confused because I'm not quite sure, because all I'm doing is I'm using this knob as a mod wheel right now. I'm not really quite sure what it means in regards to aftertouch, but that's what it does. I'm showing you what it does, so whatever. So let's kind of play around musically with these knobs. Okay, so now we're going over into LFO1, and this consists of 4 knobs. So we're going to start with waveform. So this one is pretty subtle because all it's doing is it's changing the type of LFO waveform between a triangle wave, a saw wave, a square wave, or a round wave. And if you're like really listening to these things in an isolated kind of context, you can kind of hear the differences. But in the context of messing with a patch like Fantasia, I mean, listen, you can't really hear, you can kind of hear that there's something slight maybe going on. But there's so much going on with that partial that's masking that, that's already pre-programmed onto it, that you're not really hearing it change much, even though I'm changing the shape of the LFO to a triangle or a saw or a square or a round. So to better illustrate what's going on with LFO, I'm going to switch to the initial patch. So now let's look at this waveform knob again. So in order to hear these things, we have to turn up the LFO depth knob. So let's just turn it up subtly. We can already hear that LFO is going at an audible level. So you can hear that the waveform now is switching between the different shapes. Barely. But let's look at rate. That's a super fast speed of the LFO. And then down at the bottom, you can hear it oscillate slowly. Now, it's going fast when I turn it to the right, and then slow to the left. You get the idea. Let's try the delay of the LFO. So what that is doing is it sets the time needed for the LFO to appear from the moment the key is pressed. So that makes sense. So the higher values increase the delay time. So let's try that. I have it all the way to the left, so you can hear the LFO instantly when I press a key. Let's move it all the way to the right. You can hear it's a slow LFO. All the way to the left, instant. All right, so the last knob inside LFO1 is called sync. And what sync does is it selects the timing of the LFO oscillation as follows. So for LFO2 and LFO3, key cannot be selected. But yeah, as follows, the different values for this knob are off, on, and key. Off means that the LFO does not sync to the keyboard. On means that when a key is played after all the keys have been released, the LFO will begin its wave generating process from the beginning. In key mode means that the LFO begins its wave generation from the beginning each time a new key is played. So I'm a little bit too stupid to kind of comprehend what all that means, but anyone watching who's into this shit probably clicked right away. But let's listen to what it sounds like. So I have my LFO at an audible level. I have the rate at middle position, and so right now I have it in the off position, so the LFO does not sync to the keyboard. Yeah, you can hear how that oscillation is out of time. Sounds kind of random. Now let's put it in the on position. So the LFO will begin generating from the release of the key. I guess, I'm not quite sure if that's what I'm doing, but now putting it in key mode, LFO begins wave generating from the beginning each time a new key is played. Oh, and I skipped over delay. Oh no, I didn't. I did talk about delay, never mind. So now we're moving over to this two knobs. Actually, it's four knobs. 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're under LFO2. So it's the same knobs as LFO1, waveform, rate, delay, and sync. So maybe that's why when I was showing you everything in LFO1, it seemed kind of subtle. It's because you were still hearing LFO2 and LFO3 as well. LFO3 also seems to share the same four knobs: waveform, rate, delay, and sync. So just to kind of illustrate a principle for LFO, as far as the effectiveness of these knobs and the strength of them, is they're all contingent upon how high you have LFO depth set. So let me give you an example. On LFO1, LFO2, and LFO3, I have all these knobs turned up to pretty moderately strong levels for the rate. Doesn't seem like much is going on right now. I turn up LFO-D a little bit. Not much. But listen to that. You can hear there's a delay between when I press the key and then the oscillation starts. So let's try turning down the delay, and we can hear the effect of that now. Instant now. Turn the delay back up. They're messing with the sync knobs now. So yeah, it's all, if you really want to hear these things in action, I think it helps for you to kind of premeditate what you're going to be, what you know, this, like the sound that's going to happen when you turn these knobs. Like you want to like know, you want to be able to like have the foresight to know that, okay, I better set all these knobs to the kind of delay and rate that I want before you come over here and fuck with this depth knob. Because these are going to be like really like quick effects, you know what I mean? Because they have to do with an LFO. It's not like you're shaping something slowly over like some sequence that's running. Maybe everyone else kind of realized this, but I didn't, because I'm a dumb jock and I'm not like hip on synths, but I'd realized that the modulation wheel over here, if you have that, that will basically set your, I don't think it's quite doing maybe the exact function of setting your LFO depth, but it seems to be accomplishing the same thing. So I have the LFO depth knob at 0 right now, but I have all these knobs set to center for rate and delay and sync and whatever. So let's turn the mod wheel up. And yeah, like all our knobs are coming to life now. And I turn the mod wheel down and it's back to normal. The LFOs, that the parameters that the knobs are affecting are not heard when I have the mod wheel lowered. Yeah, it looks like the mod wheel is not a direct proxy for the LFO depth knob. I'll show you. I have the LFO depth knob at 0 and the mod wheel at 0. I'm going to hold the mod wheel all the way to full blast. Now I'm going to turn up the depth knob. So you can hear that they don't do quite the same thing. I'm going to leave the depth knob up, but the mod wheel down. So yeah, everyone has different things they're trying to accomplish with synths. In my context of using this thing live, and using it to, do wacky spongly things on the fly, I am going to make the decision to always have the rate knobs set high, so that if I accidentally am playing a patch with the keyboard or whatever, and I accidentally, and it's normal, but then as soon as you tweak one knob only a tiny bit, doesn't matter what position the knob is in, you immediately start affecting it. So if I accidentally hit the mod wheel, I would want it to sound like this, because that's kind of cool. But imagine if I have the rate knob set to the center position, right? And I accidentally hit the mod wheel, well, that sounds really shitty. Unless that's the effect you're going for. I guess all that is null and void though anyway, because I guess, like I said, no matter how far to the right I have any of my rate knobs set, it doesn't matter until I start twisting them, if I start on a fresh patch, and I'll prove that to you. Yeah, so all that tweaking I did was undone by resetting the patch until I start moving knobs. It's still good though to have the knobs set to where you think that you like them, because if you do happen to want to mess, like let's say I start with a fresh patch and my knobs aren't doing anything because I haven't touched them yet. I mean, it's better to have them set closer to where you want them, so you have to do less moving with your hand, because all I have to do to make any of these knobs happen is I have to just move it like a tiny bit, and then just like if I move it back to where I was, just like a nut hair over to the right again, it's going to set it to that full value. So we're done with that row. In summary, the way I feel about LFO is that, well, I have a lot to learn about it. It's something that I can tell if I had a firmer understanding of it, I would be able to kind of envision better contexts and like plans of action to take with these row of knobs. But for now, it's something I'm going to kind of keep at arm's length. To me, you know, these patch red row type effects still hold more value to me for live synthesis. I will say though, partial balance is pretty fucking cool. This next blue row, which is called pitch envelope, and it's got 5 knobs. Actually, it's got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's got 10 knobs. 5 on this side and 5 on this side. So let's take a look at T1, T2, T3, T4, and then TKF too, this one right here. So the manual is going to show you what all this means better than I can explain it. But in regards to like T1, T2, T3, T4, when you press a key, from the left to the right is time from when you first press it, and then time goes that way. And then the pitch is the y-axis up and down. So for any program or patch, they have this mapped out where there's time 1, I guess is what T stands for. Yeah, time 2, time 3, time 4. And at these different points, the pitch is changing. And it all happens so quick, so that's why it doesn't sound like it's dissonant. But you can affect the way that those points, those time points, are lined up with these knobs. And the TKF stands for key follow time. And it sets the time of the pitch envelope depending on the key played. So higher values change the time more drastically. So let's just, for the sake of argument, turn TKF all the way up. So this is called Soundtrack. It's everyone's favorite preset. So that's what it sounds like normal, right? Let's turn all these knobs all the way up. These time knobs. So you can hear that there's these pitch positions, these times, these time points are now scattered in a different way. You can hear it's kind of stumbly now. These are another series of knobs that I'm probably never going to fuck with, to be honest with you guys. Unless I'm like recording something in a studio and maybe I need a really specific like little pad chord hit to kind of have like a little swing to it. That little delay, that little kind of spicy swing. But yeah, that's, I don't know, man. I don't think I'm ever going to use these knobs. So moving over to these other pitch envelope knobs, we were looking at the time points along the graph just now, T1 through T4. Well, if you look, there's also L1 through L4, and or sorry, L1, or there's L0, L1, and L2. So these levels, are, L stands for level. So they set the pitch the moment, or they set the pitch at any of those points. So at L0, you can see L0 is right here. That sets the pitch created the moment the key is pressed, the very first thing that happens, right? And you can go from a value of -50 to +50 for all these L0, L1, and L2. And L1 sets the pitch of 0.1. L2 sets the pitch of 0.2. So that will affect how dramatic these T1 through T4 knobs affect the pitch, I suppose. So let's really dramatically turn all these to the right. So we can hear, with L0 turned all the way to the left, right when I hit the key, you can hear that first. That's the pitch farthest away from center there. I guess when I have it turned all the way to the right, the pitch is low. When I have it turned all the way to the left, the pitch is high. Or maybe that's just a mirror of what's actually happening, but I guess that's important to remember. Now, this next knob is sus L, and what that means is sustain level. So it sets the pitch of 0.3. So I'm not sure why they didn't just call it L3, but I guess it's good to point out that it involves sustain, because that's that would be where you start sustaining, I suppose, looking at the graph. When you've already gone through your first couple points, when you're at 0.3, yeah, that's when they have it programmed to start sustaining. That makes sense. So with all these presets Roland has programmed, there's some shit going on here to create excitement, and then when you hold the note, yeah, you just get a sustained effect. And that's to create texture, I suppose, is why that is. Because if it was just a sustained thing the whole way, maybe with like a little attack, I mean, that would sound dull. It wouldn't sound like any pressings of these keys really have character. And then we also have the end L, which can be called L4, I guess, too. But that's that will set the pitch of 0.4. And again, these have values of -50 and +50. And I think that just means like units on the wheel. I don't think it has to do with cents or semitones. Maybe it does. I don't know. And the important thing to know about end L is that if the levels of two adjacent points are set to similar values, the time between these 2 points may prove to be shorter than what is actually set, or even 0. So that makes sense. So if you have the different points along that graph set to the same pitch, it's not going to be as perceivable, I guess, because it's such a short time where all that's happening. And also the maximum variable range of each level will depend on the velocity range in a P envelope, pitch envelope. So the velocity ranges are, I won't get into that yet, but in any case, let's fuck with sustain level. So when I have it all the way to the left, that sustained pitch is longer. Or yeah, I can't really articulate what's going on, but you can hear you can hear what it does to the sound. And if you have that graph in your head that I showed you, I mean, maybe it'll make sense to you. That's kind of a sassy noise. That's kind of cool. Now this is the end. So this point makes a lot of sense to me. This is pretty self-explanatory. You're just setting where the pitch lands at the very end. And then velocity, there's three ranges. It looks like there's what's called 0, and it's between 1 octave up or 1 octave down. There's one called number 1, which is 1.5 octave up or 1.5 octaves down, and then there's velocity range number 2, which is 2 octaves up and 2 octaves down. So that's 2 octaves up. That's 1.5 octaves. And that's 1 octave. Okay, so let's go down to this next blue row, which these first two knobs are in a section called low EQ. And if you know anything about EQ, this should be pretty self-explanatory, but from low frequency on the left to high frequency on the right with the typical EQ graph, if you keep that in mind, what you're doing here is for the low frequencies, which start from 63 hertz and go all the way up to 840 hertz, between 63 and 840, as you turn this frequency knob, you are hitting different assigned values that Roland programmed into here. And it goes from 63, turn it a little bit more, 75, 88, 105, 125, 150, 175, blah, 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 to different specific values that are in the manual until you hit 840. So what you're doing when you're turning this knob is you're setting where you want to boost gain of the sound. So I have a preset now called Rich Brass. So let's hear what it sounds like clean. Now let's try boosting the 75 or 88 hertz. Now I moved it to 840 hertz and I'm boosting at 840. Now the gain, it's important to know that when you're in center mode, you're at 0 decibels unison, right? When you turn the knob to the left, you're down -12, and you turn it all the way to the right, you're up +12. So I'm boosting or subtracting. It's important to know that. High EQ is this next section over here, and it's the same thing, the same principles, and this time you are starting at a value of 250 hertz rather than 840 like you may have assumed, because you would think that if low gain knob over here, if the frequency there, if the highest is 840 hertz, you would think that that would be like the starting point for high EQ, but that's not the case. You're starting at 250 hertz, and then the middle position, I guess, is like about 840 or 1,000. And then the highest value is 9.5 hertz, or kilohertz, sorry, 9.5 kilohertz. So the only other knob that there is differently, though, is this one called Q. And Q, or known as high Q, sets the width of the frequency band where the gain is boosted or cut. So that just means you're covering a wider range of frequencies rather than a narrower one. And I guess that makes sense to have the Q and the higher frequencies rather than the lower frequencies, because the lower frequencies are such more specific and have more specific purposes that are more nuanced. So let's reset this patch and let's just play with high EQ real quick. So let's boost around like 3,000. And let's really narrow our Q. And now we're widening our Q. So that's a wider range of frequencies that are being boosted. And now we're narrowing it. You can feel it narrow, can't you? You can feel it kind of squeeze into a narrow band when I do that. Let's try the same thing, but subtractive EQ. You can feel it subtracting a narrower and narrower band and then a wider and wider band. And the context of where that might be useful is perhaps a filter sweep when you are doing some sort of a arpeggio or sequence maybe. I got an arpeggiator in hold mode. yeah, with Q, we're going to select a narrow band, and we're just going to select any frequency. So it's kind of a sluggish way to do a filter sweep, but you get the idea. Just to get back to my comments I was making on some of these other knobs, so I'm staying somewhat consistent here. Certain knobs here I want in certain positions as my default positions. Like anything that has to do with setting the gain, I want it unison at 0 or at center. Probably doesn't hurt to have Q kind of at a not quite super narrow area, but kind of something moderately narrow. Because if I ever want to fuck with the frequency, I'm probably wanting to do something pretty specific anyway. All right, so now I'm going to talk about this final blue section right here called chorus. And these are 4 knobs that affect chorus. So if you already know if you already know the basics of chorus, like it's a common effect on guitar pedals, on almost all kinds of things in music, then I guess fast forward, because this is probably going to be some pretty self-explanatory shit. Anything that has chorus has these parameters, but in the context of a D-05 or a D-50, this first knob called type, chorus type, there's 8 different types on this thing, so I'll run through them. There's chorus 1, and that is it's just called chorus 1, and it's at the most left position. This is rich brass. Let's turn on the chorus. Let's turn the depth knob up all the way. And it just sets, the depth. So we're listening to chorus 1. Now we get a number 2, and that's chorus 2. So you can hear that chorus kind of subtly. Let's turn the rate up a little bit. This is clearly a chorus. This is a flanger now. That's position 3. So position 3 is called flanger 1. Position 4 is called flanger 2. Position 5 is called feedback chorus. Position 6 is tremolo. Position 7 is called chorus tremolo. Position 8 is called dimension. So that's what those all sound like. And then rate, I'm not going to explain what rate is on chorus. Like, you can look that up anywhere, but let's put it on chorus 1. And then so I already went over the depth of chorus. So balance over here is chorus balance, and this sets the volume balance of the chorus relative to the normal sound. So that's an interesting thing to know. So maybe you could have a really wacky chorus or a specific chorus ready at your will, and then don't touch any of these knobs, and only be thinking about this knob over here, so that you have your chorus ready to go. So when I have it turned all the way to the right, I have nothing but the normal sound. When I turn it to the left, or sorry, it's the other way around. When it's all the way to the left, all you hear is the normal sound. All the way to the right, I still hear the normal sound, but lots of chorus. So that could be a cool contextually, and like, again, the situation of an arpeggio or maybe a sustained chord, you're just doing a slow balance sweep. So let's hold a chord. That's kind of a cool effect to slowly sweep over like that. Let's see what that sounds like. Let's turn the tempo up. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this final strip over here, and it has to do with, now since we're in red and not blue, we're dealing with the entire patch rather than just the commons or the upper and lower tones. So let's talk about output mode. This is having to do with reverb output, and it basically determines how the tones take on the reverb effect and how the tones appear at the outputs. So what that means is, so basically in real life, a sound is reverberated acoustically in three different parts, three different phases. First, you hear the direct sound as it travels from the source outwards. The next sound is the early reflection resounding once or several times from walls, ceilings, and floors. And then finally, you hear the reverberated sound as it reflects many times in the environment. So what does that all mean? So in the context of the D-50 output knob, this is the diagram they included in the manual that explains what I just said about how it reflects. And the different modes, these are the different modes. There's 4 of them. And so the first one is stereo reverb, and it works on the mixed sound of the upper and lower tones and is sent out in stereo. Number 2 is the mixture of upper and lower takes on stereo reverb, and then the direct sound is sent out separately for upper and lower. Position 3, only the upper tone takes on the reverb. Upper and lower tones are sent out separately. And then 4, only the lower tone takes on reverb. Upper and lower tones are sent out separately. So, oh, God, I need to take a breath. I don't know how much you're going to be able to really tell the difference, because I think that all the character is going to be more driven by the type of reverb that you select rather than the output mode. So, well, I guess it's less of a subtle effect than I thought. If you have the reverb set to a pretty powerful level, then you can kind of hear it take on a dramatic effect depending on the output mode. So I have the reverb balance knob turned up pretty high, and I have just a random reverb type selected. Now let's start in position 1, which is stereo reverb, works on the mixed sound of upper and lower and is sent out in stereo. Sounds pretty normal. Now let's try going to number 2. Sounds a little different. Position 3. Sounds a little different. Sounds like there's some dynamic stuff happening there with the way, like I described, how you're perceiving the reflections of sound. Position 4. So yeah, that makes sense. Only the lower tone takes on the reverb in position 4. That sounds kind of duller, more subtle reverb. It's pretty self-explanatory reverb type. There's 32 different types of reverbs, and they're all in the manual. I'm not going to go through all of them. but some of them are pretty spicy. Some of them are kind of regular. And balance just sets the volume of the reverb. And then total volume over here has nothing to do with reverb. It's an important knob though. It's important to keep it in middle position so that when you set a fresh patch and you're like, oh fuck, this thing's too quiet, even when you turn up the D50's volume knob, you can just quickly come over here and max it out. Maybe if you have a sequencer going too, this knob could take on some more meaning, because maybe you could do like a volume fade type thing. To close out a song. All right, so now we're going to talk about the top rows, the white rows, that are only specific to individual partials. So the first thing we got to do is make sure that we are in partial select mode. So right now we're just going to go ahead and select all of our partials. And we're going to arm the partials as well to be muted if I want to mute any of them. All right, so let's look at this first knob here. All these knobs you see in this section are under the heading WG waveform. So this first knob, WF, stands for waveform. And what it does is there's two options as you turn the knob. Either square wave or sawtooth wave. And a sawtooth waveform is produced by processing a square waveform at the TVF. That is, all the waveform are square at WG, which is wave generator, even when the sawtooth is selected. So the other thing I'll mention too is that a square waveform has exactly the same width up or down, but a pulse waveform has different widths. The ratio of upper width to lower is called pulse width. So depending on the set pulse width value, the harmonic content of the sound will change greatly. And this knob here to the right is called PW, pulse width, and it goes from a value of 0 to 100. And when the sawtooth is selected with the WF knob, the pulse width raises the pitch by 50%, or sorry, a pulse width knob set at 50% will raise the pitch by an octave. And you know, this is a little picture they have of the pulse width graph. Here it is at the value 0 on the knob, it says 50% here, and then when the knob is at the value of 50, it's that big, and then when you go to 100, the pulse width is 97%. But in any case, we'll hear what that's. I have an initial patch loaded, and so right now I am in square wave, and now we're in sawtooth wave. It's a pretty subtle difference, but you can hear, let's say I turn this knob, the pulse width knob, let's set it down to 0. And you can see how it went up an octave when I turned to the sawtooth wave from the square wave, just like I described. Let's try moving it to 50% now, the pulse width. And now we are not going up an octave. Now I'll move the pulse width to 100. And yeah, we don't go up an octave like that. But so it seems that when you have the pulse width knob all the way to the left, then moving from a square wave to a saw wave will go up an octave in that situation, but otherwise it won't. So now we'll look at this knob here, pulse width velocity, PV. or sorry, PW velocity. So what this knob does is it sets the sensitivity of the velocity that controls pulse width. With negative values, the pulse width becomes smaller by playing the keyboard harder, and with positive value, the pulse width becomes wider by playing the keyboard harder. So basically, yeah, so I have the knob it goes all the way to the left to a value of -7 and all the way to the right to a value of +7. So here, I'm going to stroke the key softly, and you can hear that pulse width, and then watch what happens when I hammer the key. Now, if I set it to a negative value, it should have an inverse effect. Well, we just found something interesting nonetheless. That I can do like a little spongly kind of noise if I twist this knob while I'm pressing a key. So that's important to know in the context of trying to do some tricks live. Because like I said many times in this video, I don't really give a shit about using this device to like slowly create a patch that I can store for later. I just want to do musical things with it live. So that's kind of cool. This next knob over here is pulse width. I keep saying pulse width in a fucked up way. Pulse width. Pulse width. God, that's a hard word for me to say. Sorry, guys. This basically, this knob controls the aftertouch range. So it sets the sensitivity of aftertouch that controls the pulse width. Pulse width. Jesus fuck. With negative values, the pulse width becomes smaller with stronger aftertouch, and with positive values, the pulse width becomes wider with stronger aftertouch. And like the velocity knob, it goes from a value of -7 to +7. So I just took my hands away and the key is still ringing. So I'll show you. I'm not sure how that happened. It might be a situation of sticky keys, like a MIDI error. But whatever. This aftertouch doesn't seem to be aftertouch seems to be a pretty subtle effect that I'm not really concerned with. I'll probably never use this knob. All right, so this next part, so this next knob over here is pulse width LFO select. So what this does, it's actually pulse width modulation LFO select, PWM, and basically pulse width modulation means changing the pulse width periodically. LFO select, your choice in that decides which of the LFOs is to be used for modulating the pulse width. So this is kind of a graph that shows what's going on. This is the waveform, or sorry, the pulse width, and the choices of the knob are +1, -1, +2, -2, +3, -3, and that basically just signifies the LFO phase. So I'll show you what that does. So let's just pick any of these. One thing I know is if I hold a key kind of like over here with the other knob I showed you, I think it was pulse width velocity. What'll happen is it'll do that little stutter spongle noise too if I move this knob while I'm holding a key. That's kind of a cool effect, but let's just select the first option, positive LFO one phase, or +1, I should say, and we're gonna use this next knob to make shit happen. This is the pulse width modulation depth. So it just sets a higher value, just deepens the effect of the pulse width modulation. All right, so this final knob in the WG waveform series is called PCM. And what it does is it selects one of the 100 different sampled waves of the PCM waveform, or the PCM sound generator. So keep in mind, like I said before, a PCM is just a sample of, something, whether it's like a harp or a clarinet or whatever, that is heard really quickly, and then the sound that sustains after the PCM is played is the synth sound generator. So there's two different things. So when we pick a different sample with the PCM knob, we're probably still going to hear the same synth sound generator type of sound sustaining, despite our different choice of PCM samples. So let's test that. So I've got a patch selected called Metal Harp. That's what it sounds like normally. And so it's kind of hard to tune this knob to the sound you want, to the PCM sample you want, because you got to think there's 100 different ones. So a very, very tiny, like the slightest movement of this knob will select one of the 100 PCM samples. But like I explained before, you can still hear that same synth sound generator being sustained, even though I have a different sample. Thing I can already tell you that I'm already kind of perceiving ahead of time with these knobs is, even if whether you're in just single partial mode or if you're in common select mode, these are knobs that you're probably going to want to leave at the center position because they have to do with pitch. Yeah, I mean, even down here in the common select mode in this red row, I mean, yeah, these also affect the pitch too. Because if you have these knobs all the way to the left or something like that, when you go to move them even just the slightest, it's already going to throw out your shit out of tune, all the way to like a lower pitch. You know what I mean? But if you have it in center, it's like, if, in case you accidentally twist one of these, it's not gonna, it'll go down like one semitone maybe, and then you can quickly like move it back to center, I guess. So this next knob is fine instead of coarse, so it's just going to make fine adjustments to the standard pitch. Let me turn chase off, sorry. Well, that's kind of cool. All right, so this next knob is called KF, and it means key followed pitch. So usually the keyboard to a synthesizer assigns a semitone to each key. This parameter can change the pitch ratio. The value represents how many octaves are changed over 12 keys. So let's play middle C, and we'll also play C5, which is an octave up from C4. So watch what happens to the ratio of pitch with these two when I twist the knob. So when it's all the way to the left, the octave is reversed. This C I'm playing down here is an octave higher than the C that I'm playing higher up on the keyboard. So it's like it's 180 degrees reversed of what it normally is. And when you have it all the way to the right, it's normal. So this is a knob you're going to want to leave all the way to the right. Kind of a cool effect is if you can twist it from all the way to the right to all the way to the left kind of quickly, you can get a cool effect for a sequence or an arpeggio. Let me I reversed the ratio by one whole octave. All right, so this next knob is LFO mode, and it basically selects 4 different modes of vibrato, which is controlled by the mod wheel. So the first option is off, so there's no vibrato. The second option is positive, which is the vibrato is turned on. The third option is negative, meaning the vibrato is on but it's inverted. And the fourth option is A and L. A and L stands for aftertouch and lever, and basically what it means is the vibrato can be obtained only by aftertouch and the bender lever. So this is what it looks like, graphically when you're in the positive mode of vibrato, and then the negative, it's inverted here. So I tried this on a init or initialized patch, and it didn't really do anything, probably because I didn't have some sort of aspect of it set to where the mod wheel worked on it. But this is a standard patch I selected called a Gritar. And so watch over here at the mod wheel indicator. So I'm gonna turn it all the way up, and I have it in the off position right now, the LFO mode. So nothing's happening. Now we go to position 1, and the vibrato is turned on, and we're in the positive position. Let's try position 2, which is negative or inverted. So you can hear it's a slight difference. Now we'll go to the fourth option, and I'm using the bender lever, I guess. I'm not really sure of a situation where, it says it's controlled only, the vibrato is obtained only by aftertouch and the bender lever. So I guess that option, I don't know. I don't fucking think that matters. Okay, so this is a knob that I'm going to leave in the center position. All right, so this next knob is envelope mode, pitch envelope mode, that is, and it selects one of the following 3 modes, determine how the pitch is controlled by the pitch envelope. So the first value is off. The second value is positive, meaning the pitch changes with the set pitch envelope curve. And then the third value is negative, meaning the pitch changes with the pitch envelope curve, but it's inverted. And I couldn't really get this to do anything, and I'm not gonna try and figure it out. I'm like, I don't know, I don't care. But this is that curve that they're talking about, the pitch envelope curve. So I think this refers to, like I was explaining before, like how to create texture. Most of the sound generator types of sounds, they have a really, really super fast kind of pitch change within this first attack right here, part of the if this X value is time, and then the Y axis is pitch. It's like really quick, I think, so that, you know, your ears can't really hear a pitch change, but it gives the sound some texture. So it's going to be something subtle. It's going to just change whether or not it's like an inverted, if you select negative, or positive, which is just a normal pitch envelope. So let's, like I said, I couldn't really get this to sound like it's doing anything. I guess because it's just so fast. I don't really care about this knob, to be honest. So in summary, this is probably a knob that I would want to keep in the far right position, which is normal, where the pitch changes within the bender range that is set in the patch factors. I don't think I would want it in KF mode. And I, really don't think I'd ever want it in off mode. Because that means I wouldn't be able to use the bender at all. So in summary, this is probably a knob that I would want to keep in the far right position, which is normal, where the pitch changes within the bender range that is set in the patch factors. I don't think I would want it in KF mode. And I, really don't think I'd ever want it in off mode. Because that means I wouldn't be able to use the bender at all. All right, so this final knob over here is called bend mode. And what it basically does is it selects how the pitch is controlled by the bender lever, and there's 3 different modes. There's off mode all the way to the left on the knob, and that means there's no pitch alteration when you move the lever. And there's KF mode, which stands for key follow, and basically the pitch changes within the bender range, which is set in the patch factors, plus the key follow pitch of the wave generator. And then the third option is called norm, and that's normal. It means pitch changes within the bender range as it was set in the patch factors. So an example of the bender mode would be like if the bender range is set to 12 and the key follow knob is set to 2, then the maximum pitch change caused by the moving of the bender lever would be 2 octaves. Now, when the key follow knob is set to 0, there would be no pitch change caused by the bender lever. So, in summary, this is a knob I don't give a fuck about. Okay, so now we're moving down to this row, and this row is TVF, and that stands for time variant filter. So the first knob, all the way over here to the left, is cutoff frequency, and it sets the cutoff point of the TVF. So as you lower the value of the knob, the higher frequencies are removed and the waveform gradually becomes an approximation of a sine wave. And then the sound will finally fade out. So to show what I just said, what it looks like graphically is, so all the way down here is level 0 with the knob all the way at the left. And it's showing you the cutoff point on this graph and how as you go from 0 to 100, that cutoff point is moved out further along the channel of frequency. So where left would be 0 hertz and then all the way to the right would be, like 20,000 hertz or kilohertz or whatever the highest frequency is. I don't know. So it's showing you what the waveform is doing too as you turn the knob. So that's what the waveform does, at 0, and then by the time you're all the way up here, it's it's turning into a sine wave here, and then I'm probably not explaining that properly, but you can fucking see it, and more importantly, you're gonna hear it. So we're at position 0. Oops, the thing fucking died. Or no, it didn't die, but it's at such a low frequency, the cutoff is that I can't hear it. I'm turning the knob. And now I can hear it. So I'm using a different preset now called a rich brass, and it kind of shows off the cutoff frequency knobs assets a little better. So here I'm at a low frequency. barely audible, but that cutoff is at a really low frequency. So this next knob is resonance right here, and it works in tandem with this cutoff frequency knob, and I'll explain that. So the resonance, it basically, this knob, it boosts the cutoff point that you select with this knob. So as you increase the value of resonance, the specific harmonics are emphasized and the sound will become more unusual, more electronic in nature. And to show what that looks like on the graph, you know, like before, we have our cutoff point and then, you know, our level from 0, but in this time it goes all the way to 30 instead of to 100. And so our cutoff point is the same, you know, because it's controlled by another knob and all these different points. But as we go up in the level of the resonance knob, look at what's happening to the cutoff point. It's becoming boosted. So here it's you know, at 0, or there's no boost, I should say. And then when you move up here, that cutoff point, that cutoff point frequency is boosted in I guess gain or volume. Or no, I guess that's not volume, but like you can see what the fuck's happening, right? I need to stop trying to understand the physics of it and just move on. And look at the waveforms. Look what's happening to them as you turn the knob. It gets all jagged and spicy up here. So let's see what that sounds like. So let's select a cutoff in the center position. Or let's move it to up here to 75. Now let's turn our resonance knob. Let's start from 0. And look, we boosted the fuck out of that cutoff position. And listen to that. Now let's leave this boosted, but we'll turn this knob. And you know how that low frequency was almost inaudible before? Well, we can certainly hear it now because we boosted it. All right, so this next knob right here for the TVF section is called KF. And just like in the WG pitch section, this KF stands for key follow, and it, just like the other KF, it changes the cutoff point depending on the key played. So just like with the KF for pitch, or WG pitch, I should say, the value represents how many octaves change over 12 keys. I'm not going to get into that too much, but you can hear what it sounds like. I'm going to play this C, and then I'm going to play C an octave up. So you can see that the cutoff point between the cutoff point, which you set over here, is changing between the two keys. right, so these next two knobs, bias direction and bias point, I'm going to talk about those now. So bias point basically is where you can set, or you can add a further change to the key follow curve and set the range, which is controlled by bias direction, where the bias level is valid. So let me say that again. You can add a further change to the key follow curve and set the range where the bias level is valid. The bias range is where the bias level is valid on the keyboard. So there's also this bias level knob. It can be set with the bias point, this knob, which is where the bias range begins, and the bias direction knob too. So I don't know what the fuck any of that means, people. I'm gonna twiddle with these bias knobs. So bias level. Bias point. So I'm setting the bias point with this knob and the level of the point with this knob. So let's set the level knob to full and move the point. All right, so one thing I'm noticing is that, yeah, so I kind of understand what the bias level is important for. So I've got the sequence running, or this arpeggio. So let's say I've got a frequency point selected. My resonance is all the way up or there or wherever I want it. So if I have this bias level turned up all the way, then my cutoff frequency selection doesn't do shit. But if I have bias level turned all the way over here, then I'm able to freely set that point again. So I guess it's the bias level being turned up all the way up also negates the selection of your bias point. But when I turn it down, the level down, I can set my bias point again. It looks like it also negates the bias direction too, when the level is all the way full. But when I have the level down, I can set my bias direction. All right, so in the manual, they kind of explain this a little better. So the bias point, basically, you can set it to where the bias level, like one mode of it is you set the bias level so it's only valid on the keyboard above the C4 key. So I understand now. And then the other mode you can put it in, looks like there's only two modes, is where the bias level is only valid on the keyboard if you hit a key below C4. And then the bias level knob can be set to positive or negative values, and they go from -7 to +7. So this is the graph they show of key follow adjustment. So the curve in the picture represents the key follow value with the bias level added. This means that if the key follow slope is different, the actual slope will differ, even if the values of the slope to be biased is the same. And they show the TVF key follow cutoff point is 0 in the bias direction greater than C4. I'm still fucking, I'm not smart enough. I'm stupid, people. All right, so this next knob is envelope depth. And what it means is it sets the depth of the TVF envelope modulation that changes the TVF cutoff point. So I guess there's a possibility for it to have a modulation in where your cutoff point is set for the frequency. So higher values of the envelope depth will deepen the effect of the envelope, and they go from 0 to 100. So I guess it's just changing how much you're modulating that cutoff point, which, you know, I may have assumed it was just something that couldn't be modulated and was just set at one cutoff point that was static. But I guess it modulates with this, and this knob selects how much it modulates. So let's experiment with that. So let's set the cutoff frequency here. Let's set it there. That's what it sounds like with my envelope level all the way down. And you can hear that that cutoff point is modulating. Now there's no modulation all the way at 0. It'll probably be more audible with arpeggio. So we're at 0 depth. Let's also boost that cutoff point. So this next knob is envelope velocity, and basically it sets the sensitivity of the velocity that controls the depth of the envelope. So at higher values of the knob, and it goes from 0 to 100, the effect is deeper by playing harder. So basically, if you play harder, it deepens the envelope. So that sounds like it's going to be kind of a useless knob for me, but let's see. Because I'm not really concerned with how hard I'm playing keys for the type of shit I'm doing. So it's probably a knob I'll never use. All right, so now let's move over to the LFO select knob. So I guess the TVF modulation is an LFO, and so you can select the type of LFO that changes cutoff point periodically. And that's what creates that growl effect, or that modulation sound. So there's the first value of the knob is called +1, and that's or LFO1, or so yeah, it's basically a positive phase of LFO1, and there's 3 LFOs. So the next position is -1, so it's a negative phase of LFO1, and then we move to LFO2, which is so there's +2 and -2. And then LFO3, there's +3 and -3. So those are the 3 options for LFO select. So let's just select LFO1, and this next knob here sets the depth of the growl effect. So the higher value will deepen the effect. To really hear the effect of this thing, you got to sustain a key. So I have the depth set really high, so listen to that. Damn. So let's set the LFO type again. This next knob over here is after range, and it sets the sensitivity of aftertouch that controls the cutoff point. And it goes from values of -7 to +7. So negative values lower the cutoff point by a stronger aftertouch, and then the positive values raise it. All right, so now we're going to talk about this next strip over here, which we're still dealing with TVF, time variant filter, but now we're dealing with the envelope specifically. So, you know, I guess technically there was the envelope depth knob and envelope velocity knob over here, but for whatever reason they've got the specific TVF envelope times all over here. That's what these T stand for, time, like time 1, time 2, time 3, blah, blah, blah. And this TK off knob over here is for key follow time. So basically, kind of like the other key F, key follow knobs in the other sections, this one does something similar. It changes the time of the TVF envelope depending on the key that's played. Higher values change the time more drastically, and there's 4 values, 0 through 4. But before we get to that, I guess I need to explain what all these T1 and through T5 are. They're all, I guess, the best way to explain it is to just look at this graph. And so yeah, an envelope curve is determined by the times and levels. So this is when the key is first pressed, where it says key on, and then key off is over here as time goes further. So T1 consists of this area, and this is where point 1 is. And then, you know, you can see that you can set these points, and that's what's determining your curve. So T1, that knob sets the time needed to reach point 1 from the moment the key is pressed. So it's how long it's going to take to reach point 1. And then it's the same thing for all the other, or for T2, it's the time needed to reach point 2 from point 1. So it's not, okay, and then time 3 is the time needed to reach point 3 from point 2. So it steps up to each thing. Time 4 is the time needed to reach point 4 from point 3. And then time 5 is the time needed to reach point 5 from the moment the key is released. So let's go ahead and experiment with T1. So I'm just going to use the patch called Stereo Polysynth. And that's what it sounds like normally. Let's set the time of T1, how long it takes from the key being touched to get to point 1. And keep in mind that this is for our envelope. That's so you hear that delay? I have the time 1 set as far as it can go, and you can hear there's a delay for that first point in the envelope. It's kind of a cool effect. It's almost like a synthetic type of delay, or I guess not, but so I actually really like these sets of knobs. I can definitely use these for something cool. Let's set time 3 now. So if I'm setting all the knobs far out as they go, I'm basically creating like a really slow up glide for the envelope shape. It's basically like a really slow filter sweep. Let's set time 5 all the way to and see what happens. And now while I'm sustaining the chord, let's try moving these knobs back. I guess that doesn't do anything because I've already pressed the keys. So this isn't something that will really work with the sequence or an arpeggio. So that's something important to know. That only works in the way that you hammer a key. Let's try setting T1 to be short, but the other times to be long. It seems like T1 is kind of the most important one, because that kind of sets the tone for how long you're going to feel the rest of them. And like getting to TKF, key follow time, the graph is a better way to, I guess, understand it than me talking about it. But yeah, so basically it changes the time of the envelope depending on the key played. Higher values change the time more drastically. So let's try setting the knob at value 4, the highest value. Let's reset the patch actually. So these knobs are all off because I've reset the patch. I haven't touched these knobs again to put them in effect, but I moved TKF all the way to the highest position, and it's kind of giving that same delay of like a more drastic. It depends on which key I play too, because this has to do with key follow. So a higher key gives a really drastic effect. Let's see what a middle key does. Well, I'm not really too sure I give a fuck about this knob, because to me, like, things like velocity, like how hard you hit a key, and things like which key you press are kind of like redundant variables to me. Like, I don't know, kind of arbitrary. So I find that this first T1 knob really works to have like to give the illusion of like a volume fade in. And what I mean by that is, since the envelope has to do with modulation of frequency, if you have this knob set very high, it creates a longer time from when the key is pressed to reaching point 1 in the envelope curve. And basically what that does is it gives like a slow sweep from a low frequency that's almost inaudible to a high frequency within that first range of time. And that gives the illusion of like having like a slow attack, or like I said, like a volume fade in, even though that's not what's happening. It's just that you're starting and moving slowly from a frequency that's less audible to your ear than a higher frequency. So it has nothing to do with volume. It just has to do with frequency. So that's, well, why is that useful? Why is that important? Well, because it means that I don't have to mute a partial that maybe sounds too sharp to my ear if I want to make something sound more smooth. Rather than having to mute that partial and get rid of it or do other like fucked up things to it or mess with partial balance, I can still get everything juicy out of that partial I want, but I can also just take away the harshness by having it sweep from a low kind of gooey frequency up to a sharp one slowly. By the time that the PCM sample is done sounding off, I mean, the rest of the sound, you're hearing the trail of it rather than the sharp initial burst of it. So I'm out of breath. So like, I'll give you an example of what, and like I said, half the patches, because of the way every patch differs on what they're constructed out of based on like what they're using as their partials, they're all very different from each other. I mean, you've got patches that have like a xylophone sound as for their PCM, and then mixed with like a laser sound, and then another patch might have, you know, like a flute sound and whatever. So it's just like half these patches I've noticed, I've tested this, this T1 knob will not have a noticeable effect because that frequency sweep might not affect that partial in a dramatic way that you can detect. But this patch I've picked, called JX Horn Strings, it's a patch 1-65. This is what it sounds like normally. Nothing too harsh, but this knob though will make it sound like I've put a slow attack on it. but I'm still able to hear that whole partial without having to get rid of it. So it makes it sound smoother. All right, so we're actually going to skip down to this bottom row for TVF envelope. I'm not sure why they decided to put this because we just dealt with TVF envelope up here, but the level knobs for those points along the envelope are all the way down here. And for whatever reason, they have TVA here in between them. I would have thought that they would have made it continuous. I'm not blaming DTronics or anything like that. I'm sure there's like a good reason for it, but I was just like, huh. But in any case, so these knobs, L1 through L3, what they are, they stand for level, and they're the level of the points along the envelope. So looking back at this graph again, you know, like we looked at, there's the moment you press the key, and then that's the moment the key turns off. And these points here, their height along here, or their level. So just to give you an idea, so let's look at T1. I've got it in the middle position. So you can hear there's almost like a slight little, it's a slight little kind of slow sweep. It's not all the way here to the right, where it's a really slow sweep, but it's just here in the center. Just gives it a little bit of swing. And I'm going to set the level of that point with this knob, L1. So right now it's at the highest position. Let's take it all the way down to 0. Now I'm at 75%, and then 100 again. And if I turn L2 and L3 up, all 3 points now are at the highest level. Now I have L2 turned down, but L3 and L1 are both high. Now I only have L3 being high. So you can hear that's the slow sweep. Or sorry, you can hear that the level doesn't get high until enough time passes by to reach 0.3 when I have just that L3 set. Now you can hear it, you know, like really biting. Yeah. So sustain level is what this next knob does, and it sets the level of 0.4, which is like looking at the graph again. 0.4 is where it starts to sustain. So let's set that to the highest. Let's set it to the lowest. All right, so you can really get, if I have level 1 turned all the way up and level 4 or sustain level turned all the way up, but L2 and L3 turned all the way down, you can audibly kind of map out in your head how long like it takes to hit 0.4, because you'll hear the level be really high when I first hit the key, and then it will just kind of like, or you'll hear it spike. That's what you're looking for. You're going to wait for the spike with your ears, and that's how you know where 0.4 is. You hear that little spike, that little kind of delay, and then a spike. So that just kind of illustrates that. And then if I turn that all the way to the 0, you know, it's just no spike. You can really get, if I have level 1 turned all the way up and level 4 or sustain level turned all the way up, but L2 and L3 turned all the way down, you can audibly kind of map out in your head how long like it takes to hit 0.4, because you'll hear the level be really high when I first hit the key, and then it will just kind of like, or you'll hear it spike. That's what you're looking for. You're going to wait for the spike with your ears, and that's how you know where 0.4 is. You hear that little spike, that little kind of delay, and then a spike. So that just kind of illustrates that. And if I turn that all the way to the 0, you know, it's just a no spike. And then this knob here, end L, seems kind of subtle to my ears, or maybe I'm not using it in the right context perhaps, but basically, looking back at the graph again, it is the final point, 0.5, and basically to lower the level after releasing the key, you would set this knob to 0, and to raise the level, you would set it all the way up to 100. And the end level is retained until you release and play the key again. If the levels of two adjacent points are set to similar values, then the time between these 2 points may prove to be shorter than what is actually set, or even 0. So I've reset the patch so these L1s and T1, you know, the times and levels are not being represented because it's just the patch at its normal position. So we're just listening to what end L, or 0.5, does. And it's, like I said, it's the very end point of that envelope time. So, you know, I guess to my ears, it seems like it doesn't really do much at all, or it's not something very perceptible. Down here, that there is the DKF knob. And basically what it does is it's the key flow depth. Or did I talk about that? I don't fucking remember, people. I don't think it's important though, because it's it has to do with the key flow, which depends on like the key you play for how intense the fucking envelope is. And like I said, I don't care about things that are dependent on which key you play. In summary, though, I think as far as like defaults to leave these knobs at, I think just having both this row of the T's and then this bottom row of the L's all set to their lowest positions is a safe bet. As a default, I mean, because that, as far as I can tell, the patch that you're playing is just normal when they're all at their lowest level. All right, so now we're going to we are done with the world of TVF, which is time variant filter, and now we're going to enter the world of TVA, which is time variant amplifier. So this has to do with the volumes of a partial. All right, so now rather than moving to this row first and talking about your T1 through T5, we need to talk about the fundamentals of TVA before we get into setting your points of the envelope. So let's just deal with the fundamentals of TVA that we need to understand before we approach these points like T1 through T5. So let's look down here at this bottom row where it says TVA as the header. And we're going to start with this knob all the way over here to the left, and that is level. So it sets the volume of a partial, essentially. Higher values may cause sound distortion. If so, lower the value. Even when the level is set to 0 here, the sound may not be completely muted if the TVA envelope curve is high. So that's something important to keep in mind. And that makes sense too. So contextually, I don't think that this knob would be very helpful for picking specific partials, because you already have, like, if you're worried about that, if you have a partial you don't like that you're trying to lower your volume of, I mean, I guess you could just lower, like, oh, I think I want to hear a little bit more of this partial than this partial. Well, you could always do the partial balance knob in common select mode. So I think, I'm going to just do it for all the partials. That's how I'm going to illustrate this level knob. So this is what it sounds like at full blast. And I've noticed that in the case of the patch that I've selected, the JX Horns string patch, when the patch was reset, it's the same volume as when I have this knob turned all the way up. So I didn't necessarily boost anything. All the way down, you can't hear anything. So yeah, it's just a volume level knob for the partials. And then we look at the velo or velocity range knob, and it sets the sensitivity of the velocity that controls the volume of the sound. So that actually is an important knob. I know I've been talking a couple times about how I don't give a fuck about velocity, but this knob, I guess, is important because in regards to TVA, because with the other knobs that had to deal with velocity, it was the way that the velocity, meaning how hard you strike a key, is controlling an effect. In this case, though, we're controlling, we're not talking about velocity being used to control an effect, but we're just talking about velocity in itself. We're talking about how much we want velocity to be a thing with a particular patch. So if I have a patch that I want to like always sound loud no matter how hard I hit a key, or I guess just be really sensitive to, yeah, this is about sensitivity. So it just means, like, if I have it set very high, it's very sensitive. So if I barely tap a key, if I hammer a key, now let's try setting the velocity knob all the way to 0. And it means that if I hammer a key or if I lightly tap a key, it's the same effect. Velocity is not a thing here. Me hitting a key, it is independent of how hard I hit a key when I have the knob set to 0. So I would probably leave this knob at full blast. And I would probably leave the level knob at full blast too, just to be safe, if as their defaults. All right, so the next knob is bias direction, and bias level, and bias point. So we're going to talk about them just as a trio. So bias level, it's a curve that can be set. Lower values make the curve steeper, and it goes from a value of -12 to 0. So I guess it's -12 decibels to 0 decibels, I assume. I'm not quite sure. But this is a graph of that. So it has to do with, so the bias point is greater than the key C, or, yeah, so it sets a bias for volume adjustment about the scale length of your keyboard. I don't think this is a knob or a set of knobs I'm going to give a fuck about, just as a disclaimer, but we just talked about bias level and bias point. You can change the overall volume of the keyboard, a la the bias level, from the set level and the set range, which is the bias direction, where the bias level is valid. This bias range is where the bias level is valid on the keyboard. So it can be set with the bias point, where the bias range begins, and bias direction, which is down or up. So there's two modes of this knob, the bias point knob. There is greater than C4, and then there's less than C4. So for greater than C4, the bias level is only valid on the keyboard above the C4 key, which is middle C. And then the bias level is only valid on the keyboard below C4 if I'm on the second mode. So, like I said, I don't give a fuck about these knobs, the bias. I can see what, like, maybe like why someone else would value those. Like, maybe they have a song arrangement and they know that for, like, you know, the specific song they want the lower keys to, like, sound different than the higher keys, or have a lower, you know, like, I don't give a fuck about that though. These next LFO knobs though, LFO select and LFO depth, and also after range are an important set of knobs though, because this is how you create a tremolo effect with any given patch, or their partials more specifically. So this can be a really cool thing to do with like specific partials instead of all your partials at once too, because you could have, let's say you have one partial that is like a soft string pad, and then you have another partial that's like you know, a space laser sound. You can make it so that the laser is a stuttering tremolo, but then the soft string pad underneath it is unaffected by that and still just you know, sounds out smoothly underneath the tremolo. So to illustrate what I just said, I picked a patch called Bottle Blower. It's patch 1-86, and this is what it sounds like normally. So let's listen to, I'm just going to mute the lower partials 1 and 2 so you can hear that kind of organ sound, which is what the upper partials are made out of. And now let's mute those and listen to the lower partials. And it's that breathy kind of sound. So what we're going to do is we are going to only, with the LFO depth knob, give a tremolo effect to the upper partials, which is the organ sound. So we're going to turn off lower and just only keep our upper partials. So I didn't mute the lower though, I just turned off its ability to be edited. So you're still going to hear the lower. But watch what happens when I set the LFO depth to full blast. Now let's listen in specifically. So I gave that a tremolo effect. But the breathy flute sound is still normal because I turned off the ability for it to be edited. I only edited the upper partials. So let's hear it all together. So that's a context where, you know, you could really put that to use. And we can select our type of LFO. There's kind of like, you know, the LFO that choices we had with TVF. With TVA, we get this kind of the same situation. We get 3 different LFOs, and there's +1, -1, +2, -2, +3, -3. So let's see what they sound like. This is +1 for LFO1, -1, which is the negative phase. Now let's go to LFO2. LFO3. So LFO1 is the more obvious one. That's the more important one in this context. That's not you know, I'm not generalizing though. I just mean for this patch, this is the one, LFO1 is the one that we are really feeling the most. And then this after range is the aftertouch range, and it sets the sensitivity of aftertouch that controls volume. So negative values lower the volume by a stronger aftertouch, and positive values increase the volume by a stronger aftertouch. And the values go from -7 to +7. So yeah, you can hear as I sustain a note when I have after range set very high. You can hear that the organ sound kind of creeps in, or the LFO of it does, I should say. So now we're going to move up to this row. So we're in the world of TVA in this row, and this deals with our time points. And in this case, it's just like the TVF in that there is the same kind of structure, the same envelope graph at play here, where there is the time from when you press the key all the way to the key off, and also /0.5, you know, where it totally ends. And we're, yeah, like just like with the time variant filter, now we're dealing with time variant amplifiers. So we're dealing with volume and not filter or frequency or whatever. So this is basically, you know how earlier I was talking about T1 and the time variant filter, how you can create with this knob, how you can create like the illusion of like a volume fade. Well, now that we're in TVA and not TVF, this will actually give you a true volume fade. So this, I have a fresh patch that has not have any knobs activated on it yet. This is bottle blower yet again. And let's, you know, I'm gonna turn this knob and activate it, and now I'm gonna put it back to where it was at the lowest level. And as we increase this knob, we're increasing the time it takes to hit 0.1 from the time I hit the key. So let's put it in the middle position. And you can hear there's a slow attack, because the volume is essentially going from 0 to, I assume, or the volume is going from like negative infinity decibels or something, whatever the lowest volume it is on this machine, and then fading up to, I assume, 0 decibels, or in that time between 0.0 and 0.1. So if I set this knob as high as it goes, it's a super slow volume fade, because we're basically making 0.1 happen really far out from 0.0. Yeah, see how it takes forever to hit 0.1? Now, these knobs, these points, these T's are going to have a lot bigger, are going to be a lot more affected by the choice of patch that you're using, because the PCMs that are different for every patch has a different assignment of a sound sample to it. You know, some use flute sounds, some use laser sounds, some use drum sounds. So whatever patch you pick, or whatever partial that you're looking at, is going to be dependent on whether or not these knobs do anything significant. Because you might have a sample that like resonates, or like moves through time differently. Like a sharp snare drum hit is going to be has a different dynamic of time of how the sound moves than maybe the sound of a water droplet. You know what I mean? So it all depends on which partials you have assigned, or what these knobs are going to do. So let's say I turn T1 is at 0. Let's move T2 all the way to the top. And we're getting that full whistling sound. But if I move it all the way to 0, it's setting the point 2 farther out from point 1. And that basically is going to fuck with the PCM sound sample of that breathy whisper noise in a way that it's maybe not going to fuck with that organ sound that we're having in our upper partials. So it's affecting the lower partial more than the upper partial to our ears. Now let's T3. T3 is kind of insignificant here. Let's fuck with T4 now. Let's fuck with T5. Now that is a powerful knob. T5 is a powerful knob. You might as well throw T4, T3, and T2 in the garbage in this context for this patch, but like, wow, T5 is incredible. So T5 is basically your sustain time, right? It's the time needed to reach 0.5 from the moment the key is released. But it's the point after the sustain. Look at the fucking graph. So it's the point here. It's the final point. So it's when you release the key to where the sound actually stops, because the sound bleeds through a little bit after you release the key. So if you're setting T5 to full blast, that means that basically when you release the key and you take your finger off of it, it's going to sustain for a long time if you have T5 set high. So let's find out what T5 does when I have it set to like 75%. So that is a knob that I'm going to cherish. That's a super useful knob for me, because when I've got a guitar strapped around my neck and I'm trying to like dance between my pedal board and then my like synthesizer on stage and shit like that, and I don't have time to like just be like clutching onto my keyboard here and like playing intricate stuff with it, I may have to like have it set a patch set up so I can just kind of tap some notes with one hand, like kind of lazily, and then walk away from the keyboard. Because I have to do like a quick maneuver to like grab a guitar pick or whatever. This is a perfect knob for me to be able to just like set the keys that'll allow me to do that. I like it too because I'm a huge fan of like, delay and reverb, and I really like, effects chains where you're sending a delay through a reverb and then through a delay again to kind of give it this like washed out type of sound. So this really dreamy kind of feel. And that's what this T5 knob is going to allow me to do. It's like a synthetic, it's like a fake delay reverb type of chain. It's the illusion of like a washed out kind of reverb delay. All right, so now we're going to look at TKF, and that's key follow time, as you know by now, and this can change the time of the TVA envelope depending on the key played, and it goes from values of 0 to 4. Higher values change the time more drastically. So yet again, I'm going to show you the same graph as before, but in this case, we're dealing with TVA, not TVF. So higher keys are gonna have a more intense effect of so let's turn it all the way to the sky. Let's turn it to 0. Yeah, this is a knob I don't give a shit about. All right, so let's move over to our final row. And we just talked about the TVA times, which is the time between the points along the envelope. Now we're going to talk about the levels of each point with L1 through L5. So L1 is sets the level of point 1. So if it's all the way to the left, it's at the lowest. So, but if we have it all the way at the lowest and we set our T, or sorry, if we let's say we have L1 at like full blast. Well, you can hear that that it's really loud in the beginning, and then and it's really quick too. Your ears listening to this video might not pick it up, but like it means that if the other L's are at 0 but L1 is high, that first point is going to be really loud, and then the rest are going to like be quieter than it, but it's going to be like a really quick spike. So if I set the sustain level, or sorry, if I set L3, let's set the sustain level high and L1 high. You can hear there's like a little dip where the level goes down between the points of L2 and L3, and then it goes back up. It kind of gives it like a little cackle. And it's happening all so fast because like you got to understand that this is such, if you have all your times set to the normal positions or at the lowest positions, there's a really short time where the sound is coming to your ears, so it's hard to hear it in effect. But let's set the times of T2 and T3 to be a long time. And yeah, you can hear that divot a lot longer now. Now let's set so here's a cool thing to know. So let's talk about this L5 or end level. So I just figured out where this could be useful. So let's turn up T5 so that we have that sustaining effect that I just ranted about with so much passion and how much I love it. So I have it so that it's sustaining after I get done pressing a key, right? And let's say I want that sustain to be really, really long, but I don't want it to be so goddamn fucking loud. I can lower the 0.5 level. And I have it turned up full blast now, and that's sustaining at a really high volume. which that's not always a bad thing. That could give me the opportunity to start warping the sound and taking my time with doing that. Like, it's like the equivalent of holding a chord, you know what I mean? And then while that's resonating, I can just step away from the keyboard and step up to my knobs and start twisting knobs. So what I'm noticing is that since that's T5 and that's the sustain point, it looks like when you're just sustaining, what you're doing is you're only listening to the points 4 to 5. So that means that all these knobs that you think while the note is sustaining are going to affect your sound aren't really going to do that, unfortunately. Well, unfortunate is not the right word. That's just how the thing's programmed. But you can do pitch effects, as far as I know. So you can still modulate pitch while your note is sustaining. All right, well, last but not least, this knob is T1 velocity, or you know what, last but least, this is a knob I don't really care about. But it's a T1 velocity, and it sets the sensitivity of the velocity that controls time 1 of the TVA envelope. Increasing the sensitivity shortens time 1 by stronger playing, and there's 4 different values, 0 through 4. This, I guess it makes sense that it only affects time 1, because if you're thinking about like velocity, well, it's a measure of how hard you're hitting a key. And that's the impact of your finger on the key. So that's going to only concern that first set of time between 0.0 and 0.1, because it's that impact point. I played around with this knob just now off camera, and it doesn't really, I don't know, I don't think it's very relevant. All right, so my final thoughts on the DTronics DT-01, and that's that I love the device. I think it's a revolutionary tool, because it allows you to like dynamically in hands-on really kind of create your sounds and edit your patches by feeling your way through it rather than menu diving. Because when you have to menu dive, it makes it impossible to really be creative, and it makes it really daunting to edit sounds. Because if I have two parameters that deal with something like LFO, but I have to menu dive to get from one to the other, and I can't mess with them simultaneously in conjunction with each other, I'm never going to have an understanding or a quick way of feeling how they work with each other by like doing them both together on the spot. You know what I mean? Having an array of knobs you can twist, though, lets you dynamically, shape sound by feeling it rather than having to plan it or think about it. And it makes wanting to explore synthesis a lot more inviting. And to kind of piggyback off of that, like, I almost feel like I owe DTronics an apology, because I was kind of being a douchebag about being like, oh, fuck them, they didn't spell out what every single knob did in the manual. And it's like, well, I kind of get it now. Like, it was having to dive down this rabbit hole to figure out what all these knobs did, because I'm a person who bought this synth and this DTronics synth editor as like my first synth. I'm not like a synth nerd who bought this because I already was into synths and wanted to like play with this. Like, I learned about synths through the Roland D-05. I learned about synthesis by having to crack open. It forced me to crack open the manual, which is something I would probably have never have done, and learned what all the parameters do, the science behind them, the architecture of the waveforms, and all these principles of synthesis that I didn't really even know what they mean. Like, I didn't necessarily understand what what envelopes were and LFOs were and blah blah blah. And this, it kind of forced me to understand all these things, and I can totally see now why it'd be like impossible to like teach someone what all these knobs do by just like writing down what they do in the manual, because you have to understand the parameters uh, inside of the D-50 before you can even begin to comprehend like what the knob is going to do. So that being said, though, I will say I do not like the knobs. Um, I don't mind that they're small, because they had to cram every single knob into such a small, sleek, sexy package that's the exact same like dimensions as the Roland D-05, and I think that's very impressive, and like kudos to them. And my big dumb fucking fingers have a hard time like getting in there and twisting the knob, but still, that's fine. But what I do not like is that they're this like cheap kind of soft plastic, and I bet you if I flick one really hard, it would go like flying across the room, and I'd have there'd be like no way to fix it, because from touching these things, it doesn't feel like they have like metal washers and nuts like threaded onto them that's holding them to the plastic housing. It feels like they're just like these plastic pins that are shoved in there. I could be wrong about that, but they're flimsy for sure. And I do not like the inconsistency with the laws that the LED light buttons follow. They do not follow a consistent like code, because it's like I said, like if you just turn the thing on, all the LED lights for like the mute buttons will be off. Like I already, so I'm not going to get back into it. I explained it in the earlier part of the video where I was talking about like, oh, watch out for this because this doesn't actually fall. And like in the manual, I'm pissed because in the manual they did not go. They barely talked about anything in the manual, first of all, and they like just barely, vaguely even mentioned like how these buttons actually work. Um, I wish they kind of would have at least given you a general, like they, like I said, they don't have to explain like every little fucking knob, but I wish they would have told you, like really explained like, oh hey, like realize that all these rows that are in red are for this, all these rows that are in white are for this, rather than just like making you figure that out. But it's like I said too, the market for people who are buying this thing are probably people who like already know how to program a D50. um, I'm coming at this from a weird angle. I'm probably the only person who bought this DTronics DT-01 who didn't understand synthesis. I learned about synths through messing with this, and I mean, the D-05 is my first synth like I've ever owned, and like yeah, so I learned about synthesis through this thing, not the other way around. I didn't get this because I was a synth nerd and I wanted to collect, oh, the D-05. I was like, you know, sorry, my brain's shutting down. But yeah, I mean, I love this thing though. I think it's fucking cool, and I'm going to continue to try and figure out which knobs I can really employ for different types of contexts, like figuring out which ones I know to gravitate towards when I know I've got a sequence that I'm going to start on my key step MIDI keyboard, and just kind of finding tasteful ways to employ um, different types of modulation and stuff like that. So yeah, and it's going to be an even bigger fucking Pandora's box when I start employing these things with the Zoom MS-70 effects pedal on top of it, adding delays and stuff like that, and whatever other effects I want. I mean, that's going to open up a whole another like fucking ninth dimension to this thing. So yeah,